Well, thanks for coming here. I think in terms of the question on Scotland and the national question, we have to see this, especially the result that we've had with the massive surge in support for the yes vote towards the end of the campaign. Didn't win, obviously, but massive surge in support for the yes campaign. We have to see that in the context of the world situation and the situation in Britain in general. I think it's fair to say that we live in probably the most turbulent period in history, in humanity, and that's not really an exaggeration. When you look at what's going on in terms of economic crisis across the whole globe, massive social and political movements across the whole of Europe, in Hong Kong now, for example, in Brazil and Turkey and Egypt last year. You can see there's an enormous kind of instability at every level, and the result is a very deep anger in society, a sense of injustice, a malaise, a feeling that something's wrong, something profoundly wrong, and there's therefore a questioning in society in general, particularly amongst workers and youth, that wasn't really there before. People are starting to question all the old ideas and institutions that used to exist. And it reminds me of Marx's quote in the Communist Manifesto, where he says, "In these moments of crisis, all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned." In other words, everything that we used to take for granted and that seemed so stable and firm is now being shown to be incredibly unstable, very turbulent. And Britain, what's going on in Britain right now is an example of that, where we had a union that was 307 years old. It was the nation state, if you like, the capitalist nation. Britain was the first country to kind of form a global empire, to kind of have, lead the Industrial Revolution. Even Scotland itself, where it was the birthplace of Adam Smith and James Watt, the kind of two, on one hand the engineering side and the other the economist, which laid many of the ideological foundations for the British Empire and so forth. But you see, therefore, that everything we thought was so stable and firm is actually being called into question, including this 300-year-old union. Now, in Britain, there's been the kind of general political situation for the last few years has been one of, although not there hasn't been the kind of same scale of cuts and economic crisis as in, say, Spain or Greece or somewhere like that. Nevertheless, there's still this huge burning anger there, particularly towards the establishment. We've had years of scandal after scandal breaking out. You see that the police, in relation to murders of black teenagers like Stephen Lawrence, and also later on Mark Duggan. You have all the corruption in the media with the BBC and the News of the World, and the politicians found to be fiddling expenses. So the whole establishment seems to be kind of rotting from the head down, and there's a feeling that all the kind of political class, all of this doesn't really represent ordinary people now, and all of this shows really it's an indication of a crisis within the ruling class, particularly. Like in the past, the ruling class could find a kind of solid base of support amongst the middle class and so forth, but now they've had to attack even them, and the result is having to rely more and more on kind of rabid, backward layers of society. You see the rise of UKIP as the Tory leadership feels more and more under pressure to come out against immigration and so forth. And you see now the defection of 2 Tory MPs over to UKIP is a sign of just how unstable the situation is for the coalition and for the Tories. And that in turn, all of that instability and weakness within the ruling class reflects the weakness of British capitalism. Only 100 years ago, Britain was kind of the leading world empire, and with the British flag, the Union Jack, rising over half the world, or something. The sun never set over the British Empire, so they said. But there's been a steady decline of British capitalism ever since that time, ever since 100 years ago. And gradually Britain's lost its colonies, first with Ireland, later on in places like India, and now you see with the threat of the Union itself actually under threat. It shows the kind of steady decline of British capitalism. which had its effect on industry. Masses of British industry leaving the country, particularly places like Scotland were affected by this. You know, the whole of Glasgow, for example, was built. Well, the riches of Glasgow was a very rich city in its time, built on a magnificent shipbuilding industry. But as the British Empire went into decline, as British capitalism went into decline, those industries went into decline, moved elsewhere, and now you see mass unemployment in these sorts of areas. And actually, that kind of deindustrialization is reflected also in the support for the Tories and the support for the kind of main parties of the bourgeoisie in Britain. In Scotland, you know, only in the 1950s, actually, Scotland had actually a majority of Tories there. You know, it was the Conservative and Unionist Party, as it's still officially known. And they actually had a majority in Scotland, but yet through the results of deindustrialization, particularly the effects of Thatcherism, which destroyed huge sections of industry, not only in Scotland but across Britain, you had a massive swing towards away from the Tories, actually, and you saw the rise then of Scottish nationalism, and in its place the so-called Tartan Tories of the SNP, the Scottish Nationalist Party. And today the joke is that there's more pandas in Edinburgh Zoo than there are Tory MPs in the whole of Scotland. There's one Tory MP and there's 2 pandas in Edinburgh Zoo. So you see this kind of incredible weakness now amongst the Tories there, and all of this has given actually fueled the fire of Scottish nationalism. The cuts that have been implemented over decades from Westminster have provoked this idea that, you know, somehow Scotland would be better on its own, particularly with the discovery of North Sea oil, which also contributed to the rise of the Scottish nationalists who promised a kind of utopia on the back of this oil, you know, pointing to examples like Norway and so forth. Now, although Britain hasn't had this same sort of kind of economic crisis that we've seen in other countries yet, nevertheless the mole of revolution, if you like, has been burrowing away underneath the surface, and consciousness has been massively affected. And you see it bursting through in situations like the massive student movement we had a few years ago, with the London riots even a couple of years ago. All of these are like expressions of the enormous discontent in society. And I think it's all of this that we have to see the context of the Scottish referendum in. In other words, this you know, long-term decline of British capitalism, this turbulence on a world scale, this kind of rotting of the establishment, this hatred of all this scandal. That's really the context in which we have to see the referendum result, which marked an enormous turning point in British politics, actually. Even though the yes vote didn't win, nevertheless, there's been a massive change in consciousness, both in Scotland and I would say across the UK as a result of this referendum, because people were flocking towards the referendum, looking to it as a way to express their discontent, as a way to basically give Westminster a kicking in the teeth. You know, even David Cameron himself came out and admitted that people were using this to give the Tories an effing kicking. That's what he said, his own words. And the Economist, the kind of mouthpiece of the capitalists, said this has got nothing to do with nationalism, nothing to do with self-determination, everything to do with hatred towards the Tories. In other words, this was being used as a kind of protest vote to show that people wanted change. And now that fact that people are desperate for a change is out there. It's out there in the public eye. And basically the genie's out the bottle, if you like. There's been a massive radicalization of people suddenly brought into politics. And Trotsky, one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution, pointed out in his book, The History of the Russian Revolution, that a revolution is precisely the kind of qualitative change in consciousness when the masses participate in political activity for the very first time. Now, what you saw in Scotland wasn't a revolution in the sense that there was no channeling of people's desire for change down a revolutionary path, but nevertheless, there has been an enormous political awakening. People as young as 16 thinking about their future, thinking about political ideas, economic ideas, discussing. You know, you talk to anyone from Scotland, they'll tell you that, you know, every bus stop, every cafe, every pub, where people were just starting conversations with the person sitting next to them, with complete strangers, and discussing politics in a way that they've never had done before. And that marks a real sea change in political consciousness, and it will leave a legacy in the same way that, for example, the mass movement against the Iraq War in 2003 did, where although the movement didn't actually lead to anything concrete, although we still went to war, nevertheless it left behind a residue amongst ordinary youth of a kind of a distrust towards the politicians, a hatred towards the capitalist system, towards the bourgeois politicians. And all of that's going to exist today. There's a whole generation that have now been radicalized, and that will stick with them for the rest of their lives. And like I say, it's also had impact beyond Scotland, because it's made people finally wake up to the fact that there is this enormous desire for change, and that it exists not just in Scotland, but across the whole of the UK. And that is something that wasn't there before. There was, like I say, these signs, periodic signs of people being discontented, but it wasn't really ever mentioned in the media, and now it's everywhere. And that's the real significance of the referendum. Now, we saw that obviously, as I said, although there was this enormous desire for change, it wasn't actually represented in any real progressive solution. You know, on both sides of the campaign, actually, no one was offering any real change at all. When you analyse the actual content of both sides of the campaign, what did you have? You had people basically offering what they call Devo Max. You know, the No campaign, in a panic that they thought they might lose, went up and started promising all extra sorts of things. And what it amounted to was basically more ability for Scotland, the Scottish Parliament, to be able to tax and spend. Now, at the same time, Alex Salmond, the leader of the SNP, he doesn't offer any real change at all. His vision is for an independent capitalist Scotland, but one that really, when you think about it, isn't that independent at all. He wanted to keep the monarchy, that most democratic of institutions. You know, he wanted to keep the pound, in other words, tie Scotland to England. He wanted to keep NATO, that imperialist tool of American imperialism, which is now supporting a far-right government in Ukraine, for example. You wanted to keep inside the EU, where you have a whole load of unelected technocrats that can impose all sorts of austerity on your country, especially if you're inside the Eurozone. So in other words, you wanted to keep all of these elements of capitalism that Scottish people wouldn't have any control over, but yet just nominally change the face of things and have an independent capitalist Scotland. You look at the real backers behind the SNP, and it was some of the biggest businesses in Scotland. You have people like Brian Souter, a millionaire, who's famous for his company Stagecoach, which has always supported privatisation, that has always supported anti-union regulations. In other words, here you had a party that's basically the biggest funder was a man who doesn't offer any kind of socialist alternative or any even social democratic alternative at all. But obviously, Salmond tried to play up his kind of social democratic credentials, say he was going to be the defender of welfare, of the NHS, and all these sorts of things. Obviously, in a way to try and appeal to the working class and youth who form the main basis of the Yes campaign, the people who most were affected by the austerity being implemented by the Tories and who were most desiring a change. But the reality is, if the Yes vote had won, what would you have had? You would have had most likely an SNP government with Alex Salmond as Prime Minister, proclaiming himself as the man who granted Scotland independence. But then such a government would be forced to carry out the same sort of cuts that every other government in Europe is being made to carry out at the moment as well. The point being that these aren't ideological cuts that are just the Tories are doing here in England and Wales and Ireland and Scotland. But these are cuts that follow on from the logic of capitalism itself. If you accept capitalism, you have to accept the logic of capitalism. And the logic is that when there is a crisis like this, a global crisis of capitalism that's affecting every country, then whatever, as long as you accept capitalism, you have to carry out the cuts and make ordinary working people pay for that crisis. And that's why we see even social democratic governments, so-called socialist party, like in France, where Francis Hollande was elected on the basis of 75% tax rates on the richest, on he was policies for growth and all of this. You had the PSOE in Spain as well before that, and the PASOK in Greece. All of these so-called social democratic parties that came out of a socialist movement, but yet all of them carrying out cuts. Why? Because they all accepted capitalism. The leaderships of all these parties accepted capitalism, and therefore now you see the situation in France where Hollande is carrying out just the same sort of cuts as the Tories are in Britain, even though he initially promised growth and taxes on the rich and so on. So you see really the idea of an independent Scotland on a capitalist basis, somehow maintaining welfare and the NHS, it would have had to cut just the same as the Tories. The promises that Salmond was making were completely utopian as long as they kept within the capitalist system. On the other side, you had exactly the same sort of bankruptcy from the reformist leaders of the Labour Party, who went into an unholy alliance with the Tories and the Lib Dems, the hated coalition parties. And really, they didn't offer anything either. All of the whole campaign was based on fear, based on the threats of what would happen if they left the economy, left the British economy, and it shows how weak and how mild the Labour leaders are, that they can't offer anything to the left of the Tories and the Lib Dems. They've been promising exactly the same austerity as the other parties, precisely for the same reasons, that they know that as long as they accept capitalism, they're going to have to carry out exactly the same cuts. And so whilst there's a general recognition that you have a very working class, a very young vote in Scotland that's looking for a change, that's looking for some sort of left-wing alternative, at the same time, Labour leaders couldn't promise anything to the left, because if they did, they'd have to promise the same alternative to the rest of workers in the rest of the UK. In other words, if they promised socialist policies in Scotland, they'd have to promise it to the rest, and they're not willing to make that leap. They're not willing to break with capitalism and actually offer that socialist programme. And so the result is this complete betrayal of the Labour leaders, getting into bed with the Tories, and ending up actually, there's a massive disaffection towards Labour in Scotland now. People are calling them the Red Tories. People are leaving them in their droves. Because basically you had a situation where the Labour leaders were willing to potentially sacrifice, potentially lose the biggest base of support in the whole of the UK, rather than pose an actual alternative to the austerity of the coalition and actually pose a socialist programme. And really you see how the Labour leaders bought into this idea that, that somehow, Scotland there's an idea that exists amongst a lot of the left, that somehow Scotland's inherently more left-wing than the rest of Britain, and that although you might win some votes by promising something to the left in Scotland, that same programme would somehow lose you votes in England, where people are right-wing and want to vote UKIP and so on. But it's complete nonsense. It's a myth cultivated by the ruling class precisely to try and drive a wedge between British workers in the different countries within Britain. Because actually, when you really look at it, the whole movement in Britain has always been one movement. It's always been one movement affected, where any movement in any one part of Britain has affected the rest of the country. And you can see the major gains that have actually been made by the working class in Britain have always been across the whole country. The miners' strike was an enormously inspiring movement that occurred across the whole of the UK, where you had mining industries, obviously. More recently than that, even, you had the anti-poll tax campaign, which brought down Thatcher, and that was something that was across the whole of the UK also. you know, actually there's a massive radicalisation now amongst workers and youth in both Scotland and the rest of Britain. And in fact, you see the trade unions actually in Britain, the rest of Britain, in England and Wales, for example, have been on strike recently over the question of pay, but haven't been joined by the unions north of the border. So in other words, actually, there's some instances where the trade unions in the rest of Britain have actually been ahead of the trade unions in Scotland. So it's not, there isn't some sort of inherently you know, more left-wing, kind of something in the water that makes people more left-wing in Scotland. What you have is where the working class is concentrated, where workers and youth are concentrated, particularly in the cities. You see generally a support for Labour, hatred of the Tories, and a desire for change. And really, you know, we need to understand that you know, that there isn't some sort of right-wing working class in Britain, where people might be drawn towards people like UKIP and so forth. It's mainly out of a feeling that they're somehow anti-establishment, that they're somehow an alternative to all these other parties that are all just offering different shades of austerity. We've got to see that you know, not make the same mistake that the reformists do, which is to lose faith in the idea of the working class across the whole of Britain and internationally as being an agent for change. That's something that the reformists completely don't understand, and they just look at the superficial surface of things rather than seeing beneath the surface that radicalisation that exists everywhere. Now, within the Yes camp, you actually had another kind of unholy alliance, which was that between of the Scottish nationalists, the SNP, the kind of the ones who just wanted an independent capitalist Scotland, and many on the left who actually supported, many left groups that supported the idea of a yes vote, on the idea that it was somehow a progressive step forwards and would be a kind of first step on the road to a Scottish socialism. And we have to emphasise, you know, that there is no shortcut on the road to socialism. You know, there's no such thing as socialism in one country. This has been proven throughout history. Marx always said socialism is international or it is nothing. And actually, a lot of these people who supported the Yes campaign have really been kind of playing with ended up actually supporting the camp of bourgeois nationalism. You had Tommy Sheridan, for example, one of the leaders of the Yes campaign, formerly in the SSP, the Scottish Socialist Party, now in a group called Solidarity. And he actually has come out since the referendum and said the main task of socialists now in Scotland is to support anyone in the who's standing in the SNP for independence in the next elections. In other words, regardless of the fact that they're a bourgeois party which supports capitalism, he's saying that the most important thing is to support independence, because why? Well, the whole argument of all these people on the left is that independence would be a kick in the teeth against the establishment and would therefore weaken the capitalists and somehow therefore strengthen the working class. But we have to point out as Marxists that what's bad for the establishment, what's bad for the ruling class, what's bad for the capitalists isn't always good for the working class either. You know, a crisis of capitalism is very bad for the capitalists, and it means that many of them go under. They face the threat of their profits being damaged. But it's not good for the working class either. In the long run, it might have the effect of radicalisation, but in the short term, it can actually demoralise the working class. It can actually set them back, cause people to compete against each other. And this is precisely the same effect that nationalism has. That rather than being any sort of progressive step, and independence being any progressive step towards socialism, actually in the short term and the long term also, it would divide the working class, set them against each other, divide the labour movement, which is the main strength of workers is precisely their unity. You know, it's Marx and Engels always pointed that out, that the unity of the working class was of the utmost importance, and that's where the working class got its strength from. And Marxists have always been internationalists for that very reason, rather than trying to divide people along national lines or racial lines, or along, let sexism and racism and so forth divide the working class. We've always fought to maintain the utmost unity of the working class and point out the common enemy, which is the capitalist class, the international capitalist class. And in that sense, you can already see actually the danger that nationalism has, the kind of nationalism that independence has bred. You already now in England, since the vote, since the referendum, you've had this idea of the English question being raised. In other words, shouldn't there be an English parliament where English MPs can vote on English issues? And the main people jumping on this bandwagon are UKIP, are the far right, who want to use it to stoke up English nationalism. And the whole point is, with a divided working class, what else do you have? Not only do you divide the labour movement, but you're going to have now a kind of competition between the capitalists in Britain and the rest, and Scotland, for example. You would have had a competition between different workers driving down their wages in order the capitalists would be driving down wages, would be driving down pensions, would be driving down corporation tax and all these sort of things in order to try and encourage investment from the capitalists in each of their countries. And so it would be this real race to the bottom, which would actually serve to weaken the whole movement. And like I say, now all it's done is stoked up English nationalism as well, which doesn't play any progressive role at all. And it's distracted from all the class issues, all the social issues that the people were looking towards in the Yes campaign. All the questions of welfare, of the NHS, it's distracted completely from this. It's distracted away from the question of fighting against austerity, of fighting against capitalism. And instead now you've just got this debate about democratic reform, about constitutional reform. But really, even the reform they're offering there is meaningless. Again, they're not talking about getting rid of the monarchy. They're not talking about getting rid of the House of Lords. They're not talking about freeing ourselves from all the kind of capitalist regulations that the EU imposes, or these transatlantic treaties now where governments can be sued by corporations for not privatizing, for not liberalizing their economies. So in other words, we have to say, what kind of real democracy is being offered here at all in terms of democratic change? For us as Marxists, we should point out real genuine democracy is actually incompatible with capitalism, where at the moment it's the bankers and the bosses, the unelected technocrats and all these people behind closed doors who are making all the real decisions in society about where investment goes, about what jobs there are. Ed Miliband can turn around tomorrow and say he's going to create 1 million jobs, but if you don't own the banks and the big businesses that actually have the wealth and actually are the people who employ and create jobs, if we don't own those big businesses and banks, then we can't talk about implementing any of the decisions we want. And so real genuine democracy is tied to the question of socialism, to the question of who owns the wealth and the means of production in society. And really that's the task of Marxists, is to point out the class questions in all of this. Labour were shooting at an open goal actually in the referendum. They should have, and they missed. They should have basically raised class questions. They could have run up an independent no campaign separate from the Tories and the Lib Dems, where they said, you know what, let's stay together as one country, as one working class, and in fact internationally also, to fight against austerity, to fight against capitalism, to fight for socialist policies. And if they'd done that, that could have won enormous support on both sides of the border and acted as a lever to come into power in 2015 and actually carry out a socialist program. But the current leaders there aren't willing to do that. They need to be pushed aside and replaced by people who will. In the trade unions, in the rest of the labour movement, we need to be fighting for socialism, not for nationalism, not for independence, not for these distractions, but fighting for the real class issues that affect people. And in that sense, we have to say, look, we as Marxists, we're against the status quo, just as all these people who voted yes in Scotland are as well. That was the real reason for voting yes, a vote against the status quo. The no campaign was painted as just being a vote for no, as being a vote for the status quo. We have to say as Marxists, we're against the status quo as well, but we're for real change, not the kind of Obama-style hope and change that Alex Salmond was offering. We're for real change. We're for real independence, which is not this superficial independence of an independent country, but a real independence, i.e. an independence from capitalism. That's what we should fight for as Marxists, for socialism, not just in one country, but internationally. I'll leave it at that.